this is Tony Blazer back with another video here for the Motocross Vault on YouTube. And for this one, what I'm going to do is do something a little different. I'm going to go over kind of the complex relationship between the AMA and the FIM and Supercross. Every time you see a new press release saying some rider's been suspended, a la James Stewart or Brock Tickle, you hear an outcrying of people talking about, well, why is it that the FIM is dictating our racing series? And basically, we think of ourselves as being separate here in the U.S. to the FIM. The FIM should handle the World Championships, and the AMA should handle ours. But that's actually not really the case, and a lot of that, there's a lot of reasons for that, but mainly it comes down to one, money and greed. In the early 2000s, the AMA and then promoter of the Supercross series, Clear Channel, had a bit of a falling out. And the result of that was a dual series in the end that would be known as the World Supercross GP, and then the AMA Supercross Series, a World Supercross title, I think that was called. It's a complicated issue, but I thought I'd go into a little bit of how that happened. And because of that way that happened, today we still have the FIM kind of intertwined much more deeply than it would normally have been. Clear Channel, they basically pulled a gambit there to try and pull out of the series and have their own separate series from the AMA, but there was a lot of factors there that went into why it didn't work. But we'll get into a little bit of that here in the video. Like I said, it's pretty interesting story, and it has a lot of bearing even today. Almost 20 years later, you can see with a guy like Brock Tickle on the sidelines, and what happens, the AMA still has a whole lot of power, and a lot of people would say outsized power. And there's still the confusion as to exactly who's running things. When there's a penalty being laid out, is it the FIM guy, is the AMA guy, who the hell's in charge? Nobody seems to know. Kind of interesting situation that was caused by this whole falling out between the AMA and the FIM and Clear Channel at the time. So I hope you like this sort of thing. If you do, subscribe to the channel, ding that little bell, and share it on social media. So here is the story of the AMA and Clear Channel's fight in 2001. While the 2001 fallout is the one that we still see the ramifications of today, it was by far from the first time the two had come to a loggerhead, being the promoters and the sanctioning body. When you think of the promoters, you're talking about companies like Dorna, Feld. In the old days, it was Pace Motorsport, Clear Channel. Those are the people actually putting on the race. They're the people who rent the stadiums, move the dirt in, build the track, all the stuff that goes with actually making the race happen. And then you have the sanctioning body, which would be the FIM, which is the international sanctioning body, and the AMA, which would be the one here in the U.S. Now, over the years, those guys have come to loggerheads many times. In 1984, the first one was over a very similar issue. It's always about money in the end. And in 84, they actually ended up with two separate series that year. It's kind of weird. The AMA only had a two-race series, which was won by Jeff Ward. And then there was another separate series run by InSport, which was the actual one that we consider like the title now, which was won by Johnny O'Mara. In 85, the series was reconciled. They kind of figured out a way to go back together, but there was a lot of issue in 84. In 94, they had a very similar situation where the AMA decided they were going to switch from a non-profit organization, which is what we usually think of. You think you get that AMA card and they're fighting for your right to not wear a helmet and kill yourself, or have riding areas, things like that, like a non-profit organization that's fighting for your rights to ride. Well, in the mid-90s, the AMA decided they wanted to separate into a for-profit version, which was Paramda, or Paradema, I don't know exactly how you say that, which was AMA Pro Racing, which was a for-profit type of deal. The for-profit end of things put them directly in competition with the promoters, because the promoters are going to get their money from things like selling the title, sponsorship, concession sales, ticket sales, things like that. And when the AMA started to try and getting into the for-profit end of things, when they're trying to sell their own sponsorships to series and such, it caused a lot of friction. In 94, the promoters had kind of tried to start their own sanctioning body, their own promotional body called AIR. They hired away Roy Jansen from the AMA to kind of get that on the ground, and it looked like there might be a split in the mid-90s. Eventually, cooler heads prevailed, and that reconciled itself. But by 2001, things were getting real close to going nuclear again. Where things got ugly between the two was in a proposed renegotiation in 2001 where AMA Pro Racing, the for-profit end of the AMA, wanted to renegotiate their deal with Clear Channel. They wanted a bigger cut of the profit sharing, the sponsorship rights, and some of obviously the ancillary monies involved in the series. Now, Clear Channel clearly did not want to give up any of that money. The AMA, by putting themselves in a direct conflict with them, really put both parties in a difficult situation. Now, Clear Channel decided the thing they would do was they would hold their own series. Now, this was, again, a complicated issue because the AMA had a direct relationship with three of the big four manufacturers, big four Japanese. Honda, Suzuki, and Kawasaki were all on the AMA board. Now, this meant that they had a fiduciary responsibility not to harm the AMA. So when Clear Channel went and did their own series, if they did this, they couldn't send their riders to this series because they would clearly be in violation of that fiduciary responsibility, harming potentially the AMA. So the AMA had the sanctioning part of it, but they didn't have promoters now. They didn't have Clear Channel had the rights to the stadiums, the venues locked up. They had dirt works building the tracks. They had all the infrastructure going for them, but they didn't have the sanctioning body. So they needed some way to get the manufacturer to get on board. So they actually reached out to the FIM, who was the people behind international motorsports. They're behind like the Motocross Grand Prix, the World Championships. By getting the FIM on board with Clear Channel, it gave them the legitimacy to hold their own series. Now, unfortunately for the AMA, they did not see this coming, and they decided they were going to try and hold their own series, a competing series. They had the sanctioning body, but they didn't have the infrastructure. So they reached out to a Chicago-based concert promoter called Jam Sports to put their series together. Now, Jam Sports actually even announced a set of venues for 2003. In November of 2001, they announced some venues. This was the only thing I potentially liked about this series because I live outside of Washington, D.C. The only race we ever had here was in 1983 when they went to RFK Stadium, and they actually announced one here at FedEx Field. So I was like, oh, sweet, a local Supercross race, that would have been great. But literally everything else was Armageddon. There was nothing good going to come from this because you would have a situation where the only manufacturer that wasn't directly involved with the AMA was Yamaha, who had left the board in the early 80s over a similar race dispute and had pulled out of the AMA board. So they did not have the fiduciary situation. So they could have raced the new could have raced the new Clear Channel series. All the other big three would have really kind of been in a sticky situation where they were almost obligated to go with the AMA. You also had an issue where the FIM and the AMA are not allowed to have conflicting series on the same day. So you have not only the issue where you got to try and find a venue, you got to have a venue that doesn't conflict. You also have the situation where you're trying to get stadiums, and you really got to have your series in a very small window there because you have the stick and ball sports taking up the stadiums at different times. It was a really, really ugly situation for all involved. Jam Sports, for their part, they really kind of came out the worst of this whole deal because there was a 90-day window for the Jam Sports to finalize negotiations with the AMA Pro Racing. And during that 90 days, Clear Channel came back and they had like a little counteroffer deal. In the end, Clear Channel ended up going back with the AMA. But they had already signed their deal with the FIM. So what that means is the FIM was already in there. They'd already signed a long-term agreement. And that caused what we see today where you have actually, originally in 2003, you had two series. You had the World Supercross GP, and then you had the AMA Supercross title, a World Championship, I think is how they branded it at the time. And what that ended up doing is you had those international rounds. You had the round in Arnhem. You had a round in, I think, Geneva, Switzerland one year. That came from that World Supercross title. And you had, for those first couple of years, you had two series, which were kind of weird because if you didn't, the top guys initially didn't go. Only a couple guys did. And if you didn't do any of those rounds, even if you scored 1,000,000 points and technically beat everybody else, you couldn't win that series. So you had a guy like Keith Voss winning one year. You had another year where Chad Reed won the World Supercross GP, but lost the AMA series, and nobody gives a crap about the World Supercross thing. So really kind of, in the end, it kind of made a situation where you had a series that nobody really cared about. I think a couple years the guys went because it was a good situation where you could try out your bikes and get a kind of a feel for it. Maybe that's why they did it. Eventually, they moved some of the stuff to Canada and tried to make it a little more convenient for people, and then it kind of just died out completely. But the situation was you still had the FIM involved. So after they signed this deal, now the FIM became the arbiter of things in our Supercross series. You had situations where, you got to remember, this is when two strokes were kind of just getting ready to be on the ropes there a little bit. You had a situation where we had to run FIM mandated fuel on our bikes. The two strokes ran crappy on that gas. We can't run works bikes here, so you have like a production bike trying to run on crappy gas made the two strokes even harder to use. I know they had issues where they wouldn't idle. All this crap was caused by this new fuel we had to run. You also had situations where you had a guy like Ricky Carmichael losing all these points, Chad Reed losing points because his fuel didn't meet spec. That's all because the FIM's involved in this. We're having to run their stuff. These current suspensions for riders like Brock Tickle, as I mentioned, and James Stewart, all that goes back to the fact that Clear Channel and the AMA got greedy and they wanted to kind of squeeze Clear Channel, who is now Feld, the guys who run this Supercross series. They wanted to squeeze them, and because of that, it really put everybody in a bad situation where you have other people that we feel like maybe don't have our best interest involved in the sport. While it might look like Clear Channel came out of this smelling like a rose, they actually took it on the chin pretty good in another way. After this whole fiasco went down, Jam Sports, who was the promoter that had signed on to help the AMA have their own series, they sued Clear Channel for anti-competitive behavior. And they ended up winning a lawsuit in 2005 and ended up having to pay JamSport $90 million over this whole deal. So you have the FIM involved in our sport. You have our guys getting suspended with these draconian, ridiculous suspensions. You have confusion on the ground of the Supercross where you don't know who the hell is in charge and who's running things. And you had Clear Channel, now Feld, paying out $90 million to JamSport, who just were trying to, help out the AMA and ended up getting in the middle of this whole infight. They basically got used for leverage. So I don't blame them for suing them, but it was a bad deal. It's one of these things where, it's greed and all this infighting ends up costing everybody in the end. It's kind of a bad situation. Still is. And this is like almost 20 years ago. It's crazy. Now, there's nothing to say. I'm not sure why. The AMA, the Feld could have got out of this. The term, I don't think they signed a contract. I think it was originally only through 2009. So they've continued to re-up it. So somebody must be happy with the situation. I know as a fan, I'm not super happy. Like I said, when you see that FIM is involved in our sport to this level, I always feel like it's kind of an us versus them thing. But whatever, it is what it is. So clearly somebody's happy. I guess Feld is still making money, so they're not worried about it. So anyway, if there's anything else you guys want me to cover, let me know. I'd be happy to see in the comments below if you like this kind of thing where you go back a little bit in the history of some of the stuff in the sport. If I have the information and stuff, I'm happy to relay it. So again, if you like this, subscribe to the channel. Let me know on social media. My handle on social media is at Tony Blazer. That's TonyBlazier. That's on Instagram and Twitter. And I also write for PulpMX.com. I just published a new classic steel in the 1980 YZ250. It was number 139, so there's over almost 140 classic reviews on there for you to check out if you like that kind of thing. Give it a whirl. Until we talk again, thanks. Peace.